It was a cold, grey dawn in the mid-Atlantic, the kind of morning where the sea and sky merged into a single, slate-coloured canvas of freezing misery. Deep beneath the churning surface, inside the cramped, sweat and diesel-scented hull of U-124, Kapitänleutnant Johann Moore felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. He was a predator in his element, an ace with a growing reputation, and the Atlantic was his hunting ground. Through the periscope, he watched his prey. It wasn't a sleek British cruiser or a heavily laden tanker. The prizes that made for stirring stories back at the pens in Lorient. It was something else. Something ugly. He squinted, the rubber of the eyepiece cold against his skin. The ship was slow, ungainly, with a strange, blocky silhouette. It rode high in the water, looking almost empty, and its design was an insult to the art of shipbuilding. There were no elegant lines, no proud bow, just a functional, almost brutally simplistic form. His crewmen, peering over his shoulder at the target plot, muttered jokes. They called these new American ships ugly ducklings. Moore permitted himself a thin smile. The name was fitting. Propaganda back home had painted a picture of America as a nation of soft, decadent capitalists, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. And this ship, this floating box, seemed to be the perfect proof. It was a product of a nation that didn't understand the sea, a nation that thought it could win a war with clumsy, mass-produced junk. He gave the order. The torpedoes slid from their tubes with a shudder. Moments later, 2 plumes of water erupted against the freighter's side, followed by the satisfying, crump-like roar of high explosives. The ship, which the Americans had christened the SS Patrick Henry, died without much of a fight. It broke in two, with a groan of tortured metal, and slipped beneath the waves. An easy kill, almost too easy, as Moore watched the debris field spread across the surface. He felt a flicker of something that wasn't pride. It was confusion. The ship was so disposable, its loss so seemingly insignificant. It felt less like sinking a warship and more like swatting a fly. He couldn't have known it then, but what he had just witnessed wasn't a sign of American weakness. It was the first whisper of a storm of steel that would eventually overwhelm him, his comrades, and the entire Third Reich. He dismissed the thought, logged the kill, and turned his U-boat in search of another target. Entirely unaware that the true weapon wasn't the ship he had just sunk, but the thousands more just like it being born in fire and noise on the other side of the world. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the secret turning points of the war, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Insight for more deep dives into the history you were never taught in school. To understand the arrogance of men like Johann Moore, you have to understand the world they lived in. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine was the tip of the Nazi spear, an elite force of volunteers who believed they were invincible. They were the inheritors of a proud naval tradition. And under the command of the brilliant and ruthless Admiral Karl Dönitz, they had brought Great Britain to its knees. The early years of the war, from 1940 to 1942, were known to the U-boat crews as Die Good Luck at Cliquet, Zeit, the happy time. Operating in wolf packs, groups of submarines that could converge on a convoy and attack with devastating coordination, they turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. British shipping losses were catastrophic. For every new ship the British could build, the U-boats were sinking too. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The propaganda machine in Berlin, run by Joseph Goebbels, amplified this success into a myth of German invincibility. Newsreels shown in German cinemas depicted U-boat captains as chivalrous knights of the deep, a stark contrast to the bumbling, greedy capitalists they were fighting. America, in particular, was a subject of ridicule. Goebbels portrayed the United States as a racially mixed, culturally bankrupt nation, obsessed with jazz, music, and movie stars, led by a crippled president. Their industrial might? A joke. It was all for show, for consumer goods, for cars and refrigerators. They had no grasp of military production, no stomach for a real, brutal war of attrition. The German High Command believed this. They had studied America's slow, painful mobilization for the First World War. They were convinced that by the time the sleeping giant could theoretically awaken, the war would be over. The U-boats would have starved Britain into submission, and the Wehrmacht would be masters of Europe. The German belief in their own superiority was rooted in a philosophy of quality over quantity. A German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, complex and deadly, far superior to the American Sherman. A Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf was a pilot's dream, a finely tuned instrument of death, and a German Type 7 U-boat was a marvel of naval technology. They couldn't imagine a world where this philosophy was wrong. How could 1,000 clumsy hammers beat a single, perfectly crafted sword? On the other side of the Atlantic, in the halls of Washington, D.C., and in the sprawling industrial heartland, a different philosophy was taking hold. It wasn't unspoken. It was shouted from the rooftops by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He called it the arsenal of democracy. But the reality behind this policy was a cold, brutal, and profoundly American calculation. When the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, its leaders knew they were hopelessly behind. Their army was small, their equipment outdated. What they did have, however, was something the Axis powers fundamentally misunderstood: an industrial capacity that bordered on the miraculous. The American approach was not to build the best weapon, it was to build enough weapons. They would not try to match the Tiger tank one for one. They would build 10 Shermans, knowing that 8 might be destroyed, but the remaining 2 would overwhelm the single superior German machine. This philosophy found its ultimate expression in the sea lanes. The Allies knew they couldn't possibly protect every single ship from the U-boat wolf packs. So, they decided on a radical new strategy. They would simply out-produce their losses. They would build ships so quickly, so cheaply, and in such vast numbers that the U-boats couldn't sink them fast enough. The idea was to turn the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a conveyor belt. The man tasked with making this insane idea a reality was an industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser wasn't a shipbuilder. He had built dams and roads. He knew nothing of naval tradition, and that was his greatest strength. He looked at a ship not as a vessel, but as a product. He threw out the centuries-old rulebook. Instead of building a ship piece by piece on the slipway, a process that could take many months, Kaiser pioneered the use of prefabrication. Huge sections of the ship, the double bottom, the bow, the stern, the deck house were built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard. These massive components were then brought to the slipway by enormous cranes and welded together like pieces of a giant puzzle. Welding itself was a revolution. Traditional ships were riveted, a time-consuming process requiring skilled labor. Welding was faster, stronger, and used less steel. The traditionalists were horrified. They called Kaiser's creations tin cans and predicted they would break apart in the first storm. They laughed at his methods. But they weren't laughing for long. The program, officially called the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, produced a standardized design, the EC2SC1, which the press quickly nicknamed the Liberty ship. It was by all accounts a terrible ship. It was slow, with a top speed of only 11 knots, making it easy prey for a U-boat. It was uncomfortable for the crew. It had a reputation for cracking in cold seas, but it had 2 virtues that outweighed every single flaw. It was cheap to build, and it could be built with breathtaking speed. It was a weapon designed not for battle, but for attrition. A weapon born of spreadsheets and assembly lines. A weapon the German High Command, with its obsession with exquisite engineering and martial glory, simply could not comprehend, and thousands of them were about to flood the Atlantic. In the submarine pens of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the concrete behemoths built to shelter Germany's wolf packs from Allied bombers, the mood was one of supreme confidence. Here, in the heart of U-boat operations on the French coast, the crews were the heroes of the Reich. When a submarine returned from a patrol, its flag, adorned with pennants for each ship sunk, the men were greeted with brass bands, fresh food, and adoring women. The talk in the mess halls was not of danger, but of tonnage. Captains compared their scores like hunters boasting of their kills, and the new American Liberty ships were a source of endless amusement. They were the easiest kills of all. Veteran commanders, men who had duelled with nimble British destroyers and stalked high-value troop transports, described sinking Liberty ships as shooting fish in a barrel. The ships were slow, they couldn't maneuver, and they were often lightly armed. A single, well-placed torpedo, or sometimes two, was all it took. The U-boat crews had a name for the sound the ship's hulls made when they broke apart, a sort of groaning, cheap-sounding tear, not the noble thunder of a sinking warship. They joked that the Americans must be making them out of cardboard. This initial assessment was shared all the way up the chain of command. At his headquarters, Admiral Dönitz reviewed the daily reports with satisfaction. The tonnage war, his strategic masterpiece, was proceeding ahead of schedule. His mathematical models were clear. If he could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them, Great Britain, utterly dependent on seaborne supplies, would be starved into surrender. The entry of America into the war had presented a new variable, but these Liberty ships seemed to confirm German prejudices. They were a sign of desperation, a clumsy attempt by an industrial power that didn't understand naval warfare to simply throw metal into the ocean. The initial intelligence reports on the Liberty program were discussed, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed as American propaganda. The projected numbers were laughable. No nation on Earth could build ships at such a speed. It defied the laws of physics and engineering as the Germans, masters of the craft, understood them. The prevailing belief was that the program would collapse under its own inefficiency, producing a few hundred shoddy vessels that would pose no real threat to the U-boat's dominance. So the wolf packs sailed forth with high morale, their torpedo tubes loaded, ready to feast on the endless supply of slow, ugly targets the Americans were so conveniently providing. The shock did not come from a depth charge or a new Allied weapon. It arrived silently, on a piece of paper, in a quiet, smoke-filled office, far from the cold waters of the Atlantic. It was late 1942, and an intelligence analyst in Dönitz's command staff, a meticulous, balding man named Fregattenkapitän Otto Schilling, was reviewing the monthly shipping statistics. It was his job to correlate the U-boat kill claims with Allied production numbers to provide a clear picture of the tonnage war. He stared at the final tally, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. It had to be a mistake. He ran the calculations again, then a third time. The numbers refused to change. According to their own confirmed reports, the U-boats were having their most successful period of the war, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping per month. Yet, according to the best intelligence available on Allied construction, the total tonnage available to the enemy was not shrinking. It had stopped shrinking months ago. Now, for the first time, it was growing. He felt a wave of disbelief. It was a mathematical impossibility. He took the report to his superior, who glanced at the figures, scoffed, and told him to check his math again. Allied propaganda, Schilling, the man had said dismissively, they are inflating their production numbers to fool us. But Schilling knew it wasn't a simple error. A discrepancy of a few thousand tons could be an error. This was a chasm. It was as if he were trying to empty a bathtub with a bucket, only to find that someone was refilling it with a fire hose. The German High Command was so blinded by its own doctrine of quality and its racist dismissal of American industrial culture that they were simply unable to process what the data was telling them. They were stunned. They couldn't believe it. They had laughed at the clumsy American ships. But the Americans were now laughing at their U-boats. The true weapon wasn't the ship itself. It was the shipyard. The weapon wasn't the torpedo. It was the welding torch. The Germans were fighting a war of knights against an enemy fighting a war of factories. A palpable sense of confusion began to seep into the U-boat command. Desperate for answers, they tasked the Luftwaffe with long-range reconnaissance flights over the American eastern seaboard. What the grainy photographs revealed was more terrifying than any warship. They saw shipyards that stretched for miles, like entire industrial cities that had sprung from the earth overnight. At places like Baltimore's Fairfield Yard and Richmond, California, the photos showed not one or two ships under construction, but dozens upon dozens of identical, blocky hulls in various stages of completion. Cranes, like colossal steel birds, swarmed over the slipways, lifting entire prefabricated sections, bows, sterns, deckhouses, and lowering them into place. The scale of it was inhuman, incomprehensible. The reports from spies confirmed the madness. Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards were shattering every record, ignoring every tradition. Workers, many of them women who had never held a tool before, were working around the clock in 3 shifts. The time it took to build a Liberty ship, from laying the keel to launching the vessel, was plummeting. First, it was 200 days, then 100, then 70. Then, in November of 1942, one of Kaiser's yards, as a publicity stunt, assembled a Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in a mind-boggling 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. When this news reached Germany, it was met with stunned silence. It was no longer a matter of military strategy. It was an industrial nightmare. The world view of the German naval officer, a world of precision, tradition, and meticulous engineering, cracked. How could you fight an enemy that didn't play by the rules? How could skill and courage compete with this endless, monotonous, overwhelming flood of raw production? The laughter in the mess halls of Lorient died. A quiet, grim understanding began to take its place. The men setting out on patrol now understood the truth. For every ship they sank, 2 more were sliding into the water in America. For every veteran crew they sent to the bottom, a dozen new crews of American farm boys were loading supplies onto a brand new ship. They were no longer the hunters. They were trying to hold back a tidal wave of steel with their bare hands. The ugly Duckling had become a monster. The initial shock within the Kriegsmarine did not dissipate. Instead, it hardened into a new, grim reality that defined every moment of a U-boat patrol from 1943 onwards. The Liberty ship program was not an isolated miracle or a temporary surge. It was the visible manifestation of a fully mobilized, systematic American war machine that operated on a logic the Germans found both terrifying and insulting. It was a war of attrition, but not as they had conceived it. Germany had planned for a war of attrition against ships, men, and morale. America responded with a war of attrition against mathematics itself. Admiral Donitz's entire strategy was predicated on a simple equation: sink more tonnage than the Allies could build. But now, the American variable in that equation was not a number. It was an infinity symbol. The change was felt most acutely by the commanders at sea. The happy time was a distant, almost mythical memory. The Atlantic was no longer a vast, open hunting ground where a skilled commander could stalk his prey with patience. It had become a crowded, lethal factory floor. The sheer number of targets had a paradoxical effect. While there were more ships to sink, the ocean was now teeming with danger. The Allies, no longer needing to concentrate their precious few escorts on the most vital convoys, began to protect everything. The once vulnerable Liberty ships now sailed in the center of massive, bristling formations. Squadrons of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates prowled the flanks. And most terrifying of all, the skies above were no longer empty. The same industrial engine that churned out Liberty ships was also producing long-range Liberator bombers and escort carriers, small mobile aircraft carriers that could accompany the convoys. The air gap in the mid-Atlantic, once a safe haven for U-boats to surface and recharge, had vanished. For the German submariner, the hunt became a desperate gamble. To get close enough to fire a torpedo at a Liberty ship, a U-boat now had to penetrate a multi-layered defense system that could hunt it relentlessly for days. Consider the experience of Kapitän-Leutnant Peter Erich Kremer of U-333 on the Murmansk run. The Arctic convoys were the most brutal of all, a lifeline of American tanks, trucks, and ammunition to the Soviet Union. Kremer, a seasoned veteran, maneuvered his boat through gale-force winds and pack ice, the air in the submarine thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and diesel fumes. For days, they shadowed a convoy, a slow-moving city of ships. Through his periscope, he saw them, a seemingly endless procession of Liberty ships, their decks piled high with crates and lashed, down Sherman tanks, their hulls coated in ice. They were ugly, they were slow, and there were dozens of them. British destroyers darted around the convoy's perimeter like sheepdogs, their sonar sending out relentless, pinging echoes that grated on the nerves of Crimmer's crew. He finally saw his chance, a gap in the screen. He fired a spread of torpedoes, and his sound man screamed in triumph as he heard 2 hits. A Liberty ship, laden with explosives, vaporized in a spectacular flash of orange light that momentarily illuminated the Arctic twilight. A victory. But as Kremer crash-dived to escape the inevitable swarm of depth charges, a soul-crushing realization dawned on him. He had risked everything: his boat, his crew, his life to sink one ship. And the convoy, minus one vessel, simply closed the gap in its formation and steamed on. It made no difference. His heroic act was a statistical rounding error. He was a man throwing a single stone at a glacier. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the American effort had transformed acts of individual courage into acts of utter futility. This sense of being overwhelmed was not confined to the frozen north. In the autumn of 1942, German intelligence officers stationed in occupied France began to see evidence of a massive Allied build-up in the ports of Britain. Reconnaissance planes brought back photographs that defied belief. The harbours were choked with ships, so many that they were anchored for miles out to sea, and among the warships, the officers recognized a familiar, contemptible silhouette, repeated hundreds of times over: the Liberty ship. At first, they assumed it was for a large-scale resupply of Britain, but the sheer numbers hinted at something else, something they couldn't bring themselves to contemplate. Then, on November 8th, 1942, Operation Torch was launched. An armada of over 700 ships descended upon the shores of Morocco and Algeria in French North Africa. The German High Command was stunned. They had never known such a fleet even existed. For the men on the ground, the sight was apocalyptic. A German observer watching from a coastal hill near Oran described it not as a fleet, but as a bridge of ships stretching back over the horizon. The landing craft swarmed ashore, disgorging tens of thousands of American soldiers, and behind them, anchoring in the bay, came the Liberty ships, an endless line of them, their cranes already swinging into action, offloading the tanks, the artillery, the ammunition, the fuel, the food, the entire logistical tale of a modern army. They weren't just replacing losses in a defensive battle of attrition anymore. They were the battering ram of a global offensive. The Liberty ship, once dismissed as a floating coffin, had become the workhorse of invasion, the very foundation of Allied strategic power projection. The Germans had believed they were fighting the armies of Britain and Russia. They now realized they were fighting the factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the shipyards of California and Maine. This new reality solidified a symbol in the minds of every U-boat crewman. It was the simple, ugly, unforgettable silhouette of the Liberty ship. At the beginning of the war, the sight of any merchant ship through the periscope was a cause for excitement. Now, the sight of that specific, blocky form brought a more complex feeling, a mixture of opportunity, weariness, and dread. Seeing one meant there were probably 10 more nearby. Sinking one was easy, but it meant inviting the wrath of the escorts and the ever-present aircraft. The silhouette became a symbol of American industrial power, a constant reminder of the foe's bottomless resources. It was a monotonous, repetitive, and deeply demoralizing sight. The hydrophone operators were often the first to sense it. In the happy time, the acoustic signature of a convoy was a collection of distinct propeller beats. Now, the sound of an approaching convoy was often a deep, monotonous, overwhelming hum, the sound of dozens upon dozens of identical, slow-turning propellers from identical, mass-produced ships. It was the sound of the assembly line itself, projected across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was the sound of their own defeat, arriving at 11 knots, the symbol of the ugly ship, and the sound of its endless drone became the defining sensory experience of the Battle of the Atlantic's final, brutal years. It was the backdrop to a campaign that was no longer a glorious hunt, but a desperate, losing struggle against an enemy who had turned the ocean itself into a conveyor belt for victory. The cold, hard numbers that had first shocked the analysts in Berlin could no longer be ignored, explained away, or buried in reports. By mid-1943, the failure of the tonnage war was not a statistical anomaly, it was a strategic catastrophe that threatened the very foundation of Germany's war effort. At his headquarters, Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man whose career and reputation were built on the promise of starving Britain into submission, was forced to confront the unravelling of his life's work. The U-boat, which Hitler had once called his most potent weapon, was being neutralised not by a superior warship, but by an industrial concept. The meetings of the Oberkommando der Marine became tense, desperate affairs. Charts that once showed a satisfying upward curve of Allied shipping losses now depicted a horrifying divergence. U-boat losses were skyrocketing, while Allied tonnage was steadily, relentlessly increasing. The German leadership finally and fully understood. They had been trying to drain a lake with a thimble while the Americans refilled it from a river. They had fundamentally misjudged their enemy, believing they were fighting a traditional European power, when in fact they were fighting a continental economic system. The realization that spread through the German high command was one of profound intellectual humiliation. Their entire military philosophy, built on tactical brilliance, technological superiority, and the fighting spirit of the Aryan warrior, was being rendered obsolete by the brute force logic of the assembly line. The American approach was crude, artless, and infuriatingly effective. They weren't outfighting the Germans, they were simply burying them under an avalanche of steel. This wasn't war as they understood it. It was a monstrous form of industrial accounting in which German lives were being traded for mere cargo, and the exchange rate was becoming impossibly, suicidally high. Faced with this new reality, the Germans did what brilliant engineers do when faced with a seemingly impossible problem. They tried to innovate their way out of it. If they could no longer win the war of numbers, perhaps they could regain the technological edge. A flurry of new, desperate countermeasures was rushed from development into production. Knowing they couldn't possibly sink the Liberty ships faster than they were being built, the strategy shifted. They would target the protectors. The result was the G7S Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo. It was a marvel of German engineering, designed to home in on the sound of a ship's propellers. The idea was to fire it into a convoy and let it hunt down the noisy, fast-moving destroyers and corvettes, stripping the slow merchantmen of their guards. On paper, it was a war-winning weapon. In practice, it was a temporary and ultimately futile advantage. The Allies, with their own formidable scientific minds and the benefit of captured intelligence, quickly developed countermeasures, such as a towed noise-making device called the Foxer, which lured the acoustic torpedoes away from the escorts. The U-boat command also doubled down on submarine technology itself, pouring resources into the so-called electro-boot. The Type 21 U-boat was a vessel so advanced it was a generation ahead of its time. It could travel faster underwater than most Allied escorts could on the surface, remain submerged for days, and was armed with a rapid reloading hydraulic torpedo system. It was the perfect predator, the ultimate answer to the Allied anti-submarine screen, but like so many of Germany's wonder weapons, it was too little, too late. Allied bombing campaigns, targeting factories and infrastructure, severely hampered production. Of the hundreds ordered, only a handful ever became operational, and they arrived too late in the war to have any strategic impact. They were a testament to German ingenuity, but also a symbol of their ultimate failure. They had designed the perfect sword for a fight that was being won with hammers. The psychological impact on the men who had to carry out this losing battle was devastating. The U-boat service, once the most prestigious and celebrated branch of the German military, became a virtual death sentence. The odds had turned against them with horrifying certainty. In the happy time, a submariner had a better chance of surviving the war than an infantryman on the Eastern Front. By 1944, those odds had reversed completely. Nearly 3/4 of all German U-boat crewmen, some 30,000 men, would not survive the war. They were the victims of Allied radar, of long-range air patrols, of hunter-killer groups, and above all, of the relentless numbers game they could never win. The mood inside the submarines transformed from one of arrogant confidence to one of grim, claustrophobic fatalism. The once thrilling call to action stations was now met with a knot of fear in the pit of the stomach. The constant metallic ping, ping, ping of an enemy destroyer's sonar was the soundtrack to their nightmares. A sound that meant they had been found and that a terrifying barrage of depth charges was imminent. These explosions, even when they didn't rupture the hull, were soul-shattering. They would toss the submarine about like a toy, shatter light bulbs, break gauges, and send a cascade of cork insulation and paint chips raining down on the terrified crew. Men would pray, scream, or sit in stony silence, waiting for the groaning creak of the pressure hull that signaled their final, crushing descent into the abyss. The crews became younger and younger. Their training rushed. They left the pens at Lorient and Street Nazaire, not with cheering crowds and brass bands, but with a quiet, somber understanding that they were unlikely to return. They were still brave, still disciplined, but they were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival, trapped in a steel coffin deep beneath an ocean that was no longer their hunting ground, but their grave. They were being crushed, not just by depth charges, but by the sheer, soul-destroying weight of American industry. The story of the Liberty ship is more than a tale of wartime production. It is the final, irrefutable verdict in a clash of civilizations, a conflict not just of armies, but of foundational ideas. On one side stood the German Reich, an ideology built on the myth of the Superman, of racial purity, and of technological perfection. Its power was concentrated, its engineering exquisite, its philosophy rigid. The Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket, the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. These were the products of a system that valued the flawless, intricate masterpiece above all else. They were weapons designed to be wielded by a self-proclaimed master race. On the other side stood America, a nation the Nazis viewed with utter contempt. It was, in their eyes, a chaotic, undisciplined melting pot, a society corrupted by capitalism, jazz music, and racial mixing. And its approach to war reflected this perceived chaos. The American way was not to build one perfect weapon, but to build 10,000 adequate ones. It was a victory of the spreadsheet, the factory floor, and the collective effort of a free, if messy, society. The Liberty ship was the ultimate embodiment of this philosophy. It was not a masterpiece. It was the opposite. It was a deliberately imperfect tool, designed for a single purpose, to exist in overwhelming numbers. It was a weapon born not from a warrior ethos, but from an industrialist's pragmatic calculation. The Germans had wagered that their quality could defeat any quantity. America called that wager and raised them to a level that shattered the entire table. The U-boat war was not lost in the cold depths of the Atlantic. It was lost in the fiery shipyards of Baltimore, Richmond, and Portland, where a nation of shopkeepers and farmers, of women who had never before held a welding torch, proved that the collective will of a democracy could outproduce the focused might of a totalitarian dictatorship. It was a victory of mass-produced, ugly, glorious functionality. The ultimate demonstration of this industrial and moral victory came not in a sea battle, but on a single, world-changing morning. On June 6th, 1944, a young German corporal, huddled in a concrete bunker overlooking the sands of Omaha Beach, peered through his machine gun slit at the dawn. He and his comrades had been told for years that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, a fortress that would throw any invader back into the sea. And as the mist began to clear, he saw the invasion fleet. But the word fleet could not do it justice. He was stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. The horizon had vanished. In its place was a solid, unbroken wall of steel that stretched from left to right as far as the eye could see. There were battleships, their massive guns already beginning to roar. There were cruisers, destroyers, and a swarm of smaller landing craft that churned the sea into a white foam, but behind them, forming a second, and then a third, and then an endless line of vessels, were the cargo ships, and he recognized their ugly, familiar silhouette instantly. The Liberty ships, hundreds upon hundreds of them. They were not there to fight, they were there to work. They were the floating warehouses, the mobile factories, the logistical backbone of the entire invasion. As the first waves of American soldiers stormed the beach and fell under the scything fire of his machine gun, the young German felt a sickening dread that had nothing to do with the immediate battle. He realized that even if they killed every man in that first wave, and the second, and the 10th, it wouldn't matter, because out there, on those ugly ships, were the men of the 11th wave, and the 20th, and the 100th. And with them were the tanks, the bullets, the fuel, the food, and the medical supplies to sustain them not for days, but for months and years. He was not fighting an army. He was fighting a continent. The bridge of ships that had been a logistical concept was now a physical reality, and it was delivering the doom of his entire world directly to his doorstep. The battle for Normandy became the final proof. While elite German panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were frequently immobilized for lack of fuel, the Allied armies were being supplied by a logistical miracle. The Allies built 2 massive artificial harbours, the Mulberries, and through them, and over the open beaches, the Liberty ships and their counterparts disgorged the wealth of the arsenal of democracy. In the first 100 days after D-Day, over 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies were landed in Normandy. The Liberty ship, the slow, clumsy vessel designed simply to replace losses, had become the linchpin of the greatest amphibious assault in human history. It had carried the troops to England, it had brought the mountains of equipment, and now it was feeding the relentless advance across France. The same relentless, monotonous, overwhelming power that had crushed the U-boat wolf packs in the mid-Atlantic was now crushing the German army in the hedgerows of Normandy. The victory was total, a victory of production, of logistics, and of a system that could harness the power of its entire population. In the end, the Nazi ideology, with its obsession with pure forms and perfect machines, was defeated by an idea it could never comprehend: the power of good enough, multiplied by 1,000,000. The Reich produced beautiful, terrifying weapons that now sit in museums as marvels of engineering. America produced a simple steel box that was often scrapped for razor blades after the war, but that ugly box carried freedom in its hold. It was the physical manifestation of a nation that could mobilize not just its soldiers, but its civilians, its factories, its entire economic and social fabric toward a single, unified purpose. The German U-boat commanders had looked through their periscopes in 1942 and laughed at the ugly Duckling. They failed to understand its true nature. It was not a ship, but a promise of a nation's boundless industrial resolve. And by the time they realized the truth, they, and the hateful empire they served, were already drowning beneath an endless, unstoppable tide of steel.